Hello, everyone. Tonight we are just going to drift. You find yourself standing in a rather grand, if somewhat drafty, stone corridor. Tapestries depicting heroic, slightly improbable hunting scenes ripple gently in the breeze, coming from an unseen window. The air smells of beeswax, old stone, and a faint lingering hint of wood smoke from a distant hearth. You can hear the distant, muffled sound of a lute, playing a rather mournful tune, the kind of tune that suggests everyone involved knows winter is just around the corner, and probably someone's cousin is plotting to overthrow the king. Again. It's 16th century England, after all, and honestly, given the state of medicine and hygiene, you probably won't survive this period if you linger too long with a persistent cough. Best to just be an observer, don't you think? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. We'd also love to know where you're tuning in from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see how far these little historical drifts can travel. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get going tonight. You find yourself drawn not towards the music, but towards a slightly ajar door from which a softer, more focused light spills. Peeking in, you see a young boy, no more than 10, perhaps 11, with bright auburn hair bent over a heavy wooden desk. This isn't just any boy, of course. This is Prince Henry, the second son of King Henry VII. He's not yet the bombastic, larger-than-life figure who will dominate history books and inspire countless rather unflattering portraits. Right now, he's the spare, the one not destined for the throne. That weighty responsibility rests on the shoulders of his older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. You watch as young Henry chews the end of his quill, a slight frown of concentration on his face. He's surrounded by books, parchments, and the paraphernalia of a rigorous education. The Tudors, a relatively new dynasty still solidifying their grip on England after the brutal Wars of the Roses, knew the value of propaganda, yes, but also of genuine learning. King Henry VII, his father, was a shrewd and fiscally conservative monarch. Some might say notoriously tight-fisted, but let's just call him careful. He understood that stability came not just from a full treasury, but from a well-prepared heir, or, in this case, a well-prepared spare heir. So young Henry is immersed in theology, languages, mathematics, and music. It's an authoritative historical fact that Henry was a gifted linguist, fluent in Latin, French, and proficient in Italian, and he was also a talented musician and composer. He even penned a theological treatise later in life, though its authorship is naturally something historians still like to pick over. You can almost smell the old parchment and the faint, slightly acidic scent of the ink. The room is quiet, save for the scratching of his quill and the distant, almost subliminal hum of a busy royal palace winding down for the evening. He looks up for a moment, his gaze distant, perhaps imagining something far beyond the treatises on his desk. Maybe he's dreaming of tournaments and chivalry, things his older brother Arthur, who was groomed for kingship from birth, was already beginning to experience. Arthur was the serious one, the studious one, the one on whom all the dynastic hopes were pinned. Henry, by contrast, was allowed a slightly more relaxed, though still incredibly privileged, upbringing. He could afford to be a bit more boisterous, a touch more extra, as we might say today. His mother, Elizabeth of York, daughter of King Edward IV, represented the joining of the two warring houses, Lancaster and York, a symbolic and very real end to decades of civil strife. Her presence brought a certain legitimacy and perhaps a touch of much-needed softness to the pragmatic Tudor court. You might imagine her visiting her sons, her gentle hand on young Henry's shoulder, a stark contrast to the rather stern and ever-watchful presence of his grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. Now she was a formidable woman, a key player in bringing Henry VII to the throne, and a devout, strong-willed influence in the young prince's lives. One gets the sense that you did not want to be on Lady Margaret's naughty list. The life of a royal child, even a spare, was hardly all play. There were expectations, duties, and the constant awareness of your place in a very public hierarchy. It's not like they had video games or social media to distract them. Entertainment was often of a more robust, or at least more self-generated kind. An odd little fact for you: Tudor children, even royal ones, played with surprisingly familiar toys: spinning tops, dolls, though probably not Barbie dolls, more the slightly unsettling wooden kind, and even miniature sets of armor and toy soldiers. Imagine young Henry arrayed in a perfectly scaled-down suit of tin, whacking away at imaginary enemies in the palace gardens. Though, knowing Henry's later enthusiasm for, shall we say, vigorous activity, perhaps those toy soldiers got quite a battering. This early period is crucial. It's where the seeds of the man he would become were sown. While Arthur was meticulously prepared for the duties of a king, Henry was developing other skills, other facets of his personality. He was becoming athletic, skilled in hunting and jousting, pursuits that his father didn't particularly share, but understood were important for a prince. He was also, by all accounts, charming when he wanted to be, with a bright intellect and a capacity for great warmth. But beneath that, perhaps there was always a steelier core, a stubborn streak, a certain intensity that would later define his reign. You notice the tapestries on the wall of his study aren't as grand as those in the corridor, more focused on religious or scholarly themes. The room is comfortable, yes, by 16th century standards, but not ostentatious. This focus on piety and learning was very much a part of the Tudor image. But historians still debate whether Henry's early devoutness, which was considerable, was entirely genuine personal conviction or a carefully cultivated aspect of his princely education and public persona. Was he truly the defender of the faith he would later proclaim himself to be, even before he had a faith of his own to defend against the Pope? Or was he a very astute young man learning to play a very complex game? It's hard to say, peering at the studious boy, unaware of the tumultuous future that awaits him, unaware that the quiet scratching of his quill is just a prelude to the rewriting of England's destiny. The weight of being the spare can be a peculiar thing. It allows for a certain freedom, but also breeds a different kind of ambition. He's not just Prince Henry, he's the potential king-in-waiting, a thought that perhaps, even now, flickers at the edge of his young mind. For now, though, he simply dips his quill back into the inkpot, ready for the next line, the next lesson. The quiet scratching of that young prince's quill seems a lifetime ago now. The boy you observed, the spare, is gone. In his place, a young man of extraordinary energy and charisma bestrides the English throne. The slightly gloomy corridors of his father's reign have been flung open, light and air and a boisterous vitality flooding in. You find yourself in the midst of a glittering court, the air alive with the thrum of lute strings, the murmur of French and Italian, for this is a cosmopolitan court, and the rustle of silks and velvets. The scent of beeswax is still there, but now it's mingled with expensive French perfumes and the faint, not entirely unpleasant aroma of well-groomed horses, as the king and his companions frequently burst in from a morning's hunting. This is King Henry VIII in his glorious youth, not long after his ascension in 1509. He's tall, over 6 feet, powerfully built, with that distinctive Tudor auburn hair and a complexion that poets of the day, no doubt hoping for a tidy little pension, described as angelic. He is, to put it mildly, a revelation after his rather parsimonious and somber father. It's like the kingdom collectively traded in its sensible, fuel-efficient sedan for a bright red sports car with an unnecessarily loud engine. And everyone, for now, is absolutely thrilled with the upgrade. He has married his brother Arthur's widow, Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess of considerable dignity and learning, and together they preside over a court that dazzles Europe. You see Henry everywhere, a whirlwind of activity. One moment he's composing a rather lovely piece of music, for it's an authoritative historical fact that Henry VIII was an accomplished musician and composer. Pastime with Good Company is perhaps his most famous attributed work, though he composed many other songs and instrumental pieces. The next, he's penning verses, then deep in theological discussion with scholars, for he is genuinely learned and, at this stage, a staunch defender of the Catholic faith. Then, with a sudden shift of gears, he's calling for his armor. Tournaments, hunting, wrestling, archery, real tennis. He excels at them all. He's not a king who watches from the sidelines. He's in the thick of it, reveling in his physical prowess, his energy seemingly inexhaustible. Imagine trying to keep up with a boss who insists on leading every team-building exercise with the vigor of an Olympic athlete, while also expecting you to have read all the latest scholarly journals. Exhausting. The joust is perhaps his greatest passion. You witness him in the tilt yard at Greenwich or Richmond, a magnificent spectacle of chivalry and barely controlled violence. The clash of steel on steel, the splintering of lances, the roar of the crowd. It's intoxicating. Henry, in gleaming armor often inlaid with gold, is the star. He unhorses opponent after opponent, acknowledging the cheers with a boyish grin. This isn't just sport. It's a political statement. It's England announcing its youthful vigor, its martial strength, embodied by its magnificent young king. He spends fortunes on these displays, on his palaces, on clothes woven with gold thread that make him shine like a minor deity. His father, Henry VII, who famously counted every penny, would probably have had a quiet conniption fit if he could see the royal accounts now. Catherine, his queen, is often by his side. A devout and intelligent woman, several years his senior, she brings a certain gravitas to the court. She shares his interest in learning and piety, and in these early years, there's a sense of partnership. They attend masques together, elaborate costume balls where courtiers dress as mythological figures or allegorical virtues. Henry, of course, often takes a leading role, delighting in the spectacle and the admiration. An odd, or at least somewhat indulgent, fact about these Tudor entertainments is the sheer extravagance of the temporary banqueting houses and elaborate sets built for just a single night's revelry, often made of gilded wood and painted canvas, designed to amaze and then be dismantled. Think of it as the 16th century equivalent of an incredibly elaborate pop-up restaurant, but with more doublet and hose. The early reign is also marked by a desire to play a significant role on the European stage. Henry fancies himself a warrior king, like Henry V of glorious Agincourt fame. He plunges into continental politics, forging alliances, engaging in a bit of saber rattling, and even leading an army into France. It's all rather expensive, and the results are mixed, but it boosts his image as a powerful and assertive monarch. The old, cautious advisors inherited from his father often find themselves politely ignored. This king has his own ideas, his own ambitions, and an almost limitless self-confidence. Yet, amidst all this golden exuberance, this display of seemingly boundless health and happiness, a subtle anxiety begins to weave itself into the rich tapestry of court life. Catherine has pregnancies, but they result in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infants who die young. A daughter, Mary, survives and is cherished, but in a world where dynastic security rests squarely on a male heir, it's not enough. Historians still debate precisely when the lack of a male heir transitioned from a background concern into the consuming obsession that would later drive Henry to such drastic measures. Was there a specific moment, a particular loss that tipped the scales? Or was it a gradual hardening of resolve, a slow dawning that his perfect golden world was missing its most crucial element? For now, the concerns are likely voiced in hushed tones, in private conversations. The public image remains one of robust confidence, of a king in his magnificent prime, blessed by God, beloved by his people. The golden boy of Christendom. But even gold, as you know, can tarnish, and the brightest morning can give way to a clouded afternoon. For now, however, the sun shines brilliantly on Henry's England. You can almost feel the warmth, hear the joyous shouts from the tilt-yard, and believe, just for a moment, that this golden age might last forever. The brilliant sunshine of Henry's early reign, the one you just basked in, is beginning to feel a little strained. The joyous shouts from the tilt-yard still echo, yes, but now they're punctuated by a more urgent, almost fretful murmur from the inner chambers of the palace. The golden boy is still golden, but a creeping anxiety is beginning to etch fine lines around his still handsome eyes. You find yourself less in the public spaces of grand display, and more in the hushed, tapestry-hung private rooms where the real business of the kingdom and the king's heart is being thrashed out. The scent of French perfume is now sometimes overpowered by the sharper, more medicinal smell of herbs as Queen Catherine endures another difficult pregnancy, another hope that ultimately fades. The problem, the singular gnawing problem, is the lack of a legitimate male heir. It's been years. Daughter Mary is a beloved child, intelligent and spirited, but in the 16th century the idea of a queen regnant, a woman ruling in her own right, is fraught with peril. England has only had one before, Matilda, centuries ago, and her reign was marked by civil war, the anarchy. The Tudor dynasty is still relatively new, its claim to the throne forged in battle and bloodshed only a generation or so before. Henry is acutely aware of the fragility of that claim, the lingering possibility of challenge from those with a sliver of Yorkist blood. A strong, undisputed male successor is not just a personal desire, it's a political necessity for the stability of the realm. Remember, this isn't like today where we might shrug and say, "Oh well, next time." For Henry, the stakes are existential. For himself, for his dynasty, for England. Catherine of Aragon, his Spanish wife, is now in her 40s. Each failed pregnancy, each stillbirth, deepens the shadow. She's devout, dignified, and popular with the English people, who remember her as Arthur's young widow, then as Henry's respected queen. But piety and popularity can't conjure a living son. You can sense Henry's growing frustration. A man used to getting what he wants, a man whose physical prowess and indomitable will have so far conquered every other challenge. Yet, in this most vital arena, he is thwarted. And being Henry, he doesn't take thwarting well. He was, let's be honest, not a man accustomed to the word no, especially when it came to matters of dynastic importance. He begins to search for reasons, for explanations. His theological training, the one you saw him undertaking as a boy, comes to the fore. He starts to brood on a particular passage in the book of Leviticus. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He shall be childless. Catherine had been married to his older brother, Arthur. True, the marriage was brief, and Catherine always maintained it was unconsummated, a point of considerable debate then and now. A papal dispensation had been granted for Henry to marry her, specifically to overcome this very biblical prohibition. But now, as the years pass without a son, Henry starts to wonder, was that dispensation valid? Had God, in fact, withheld a male heir as a sign of divine displeasure? This is where his devoutness, or perhaps his convenience, kicks in. It's an authoritative historical fact that Henry VII sought the papal dispensation for Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon primarily for diplomatic and financial reasons, to maintain the alliance with Spain, and to avoid repaying Catherine's considerable dowry. Dynastic marriages were, after all, hard-nosed business transactions dressed up in silk and solemn vows. The king's great matter, as his quest for an annulment from Catherine becomes known, begins to consume him, and by extension, the entire court. Advisors, theologians, and lawyers are drawn into the increasingly complex and urgent discussions. You see Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's brilliant and incredibly powerful Lord Chancellor, a man who essentially ran England for Henry in the early years, now tasked with the seemingly impossible, persuading Pope Clement VII to declare Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid after nearly 2 decades and 1 living child. It's a tall order. The Pope is, not to put too fine a point on it, effectively a prisoner of Emperor Charles V, who just so happens to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Charles V is not amused by the suggestion that his aunt has been living in sin and that her daughter is illegitimate. Politics, as always, complicates everything. It's like trying to get a refund on a very expensive, very public purchase from a store manager whose boss is your angry ex-brother-in-law. Not ideal. Catherine, to her immense credit and to Henry's immense frustration, refuses to go quietly. She insists her marriage to Henry is valid, that she is his true and lawful wife and the Queen of England. She has dignity, a powerful sense of her own rights, and a daughter whose legitimacy she will defend to the end. She argues her case with courage and conviction, appearing before a legatine court at Blackfriars, a rather dramatic and uncomfortable public airing of royal laundry. An odd little fact, often overlooked, is that Catherine was highly educated by the standards of the day, a patron of humanist scholars like Erasmus, and quite capable of arguing her own case intelligently, not just relying on advisors. She wasn't just a passive victim in all of this, even if the odds were increasingly stacked against her. The pressure on everyone is immense. Courtiers begin to take sides, subtly at first, then more openly. Careers will be made and broken over this. The fate of England hangs in the balance. Historians still debate the extent to which Henry's infatuation with a lady of the court, Anne Boleyn, fueled his desire for an annulment versus his genuine dynastic concerns and religious scruples. Was Anne the catalyst, or was she simply the convenient and attractive solution that presented herself as Henry's desperation grew? It's a chicken and egg situation that keeps biographers busy. What is clear is that the easy confidence of Henry's early reign is rapidly eroding, replaced by a steely determination, a single-minded obsession that will brook no opposition. The quest for a male heir has now become a quest to bend God, the Pope, and the entire established order to his will. The air in those private chambers is thick with it. The ambition, the anxiety, and the dawning realization that if the old ways won't give him what he needs, Henry VIII is more than capable of forging new ones. The earth under England's feet is beginning to feel distinctly unstable. The instability you felt growing in those private royal chambers is now palpable throughout the court, a low, thrumming hum of anticipation and anxiety. Cardinal Wolsey's star, once so brilliantly ascendant, is now visibly dimming, his failure to secure the papal annulment from Catherine of Aragon proving to be his undoing. The king's great matter isn't just a matter anymore, it's the matter, eclipsing all else. And into this charged atmosphere steps a woman who is not a princess of foreign blood, nor a docile lady-in-waiting content to stay in the shadows. You observe Anne Boleyn, her dark eyes flashing with intelligence and an ambition that matches, in its own way, the king's. She is not, by conventional Tudor standards, a classic beauty. Her complexion is sallow, her figure slim rather than fashionably rounded. But she possesses a captivating allure, a sharpness of wit, a sophisticated continental polish, having spent years at the French court, and an undeniable charisma that sets her apart. Henry, a man used to women fawning over him, is utterly mesmerized. He writes her love letters, passionate and surprisingly vulnerable, letters that still exist today, a testament to his obsession. Think of them as the 16th century equivalent of deeply embarrassing, heartfelt DMs, but penned by the King of England. Awkward for the historians who read them, probably even more awkward for Anne at times. Anne, however, is no fool. She has seen how kings treat their mistresses, indulged for a time, then cast aside when a new fancy takes hold. Her own sister, Mary Boleyn, had been one of Henry's earlier dalliances, a fact that must have given Anne a certain pragmatic insight into royal affections. Anne plays a very different game. She famously refuses to become Henry's mistress. She will be queen or nothing. This isn't just coy withholding, it's a shrewd, calculated strategy. She understands that Henry's desire for a legitimate son is paramount, and she positions herself as the woman who can provide one, if only he can make her his lawful wife. It's a high-stakes gamble, requiring nerves of steel and an unwavering belief in her own destiny, or perhaps in her ability to manage the king. You witness her steady rise, the Boleyn faction gaining influence at court as Wolsey's wanes. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, and her brother George are ambitious men who see in Anne's relationship with the king a golden opportunity for their family's advancement. They become key players in the push for the annulment and the subsequent break with Rome. It's an authoritative historical fact that Anne Boleyn was a committed supporter of evangelical and reformist religious ideas that were gaining traction in England and on the continent. She owned and read a copy of William Tyndale's forbidden English translation of the New Testament, a dangerous act in itself. Her religious leanings undoubtedly influenced Henry, or at least provided a convenient intellectual framework for his defiance of papal authority. The court becomes a hotbed of intrigue. Those loyal to Queen Catherine view Anne with suspicion and outright hostility, seeing her as a homewrecker and a heretic. Those who see opportunity in the king's infatuation and the shifting religious landscape flock to Anne's side. It's a precarious balancing act for everyone involved. You might imagine courtiers practicing their most neutral expressions, trying not to commit too obviously to one side or the other, just in case the wind changed direction suddenly. A bit like trying to navigate a family dinner where two very opinionated relatives are having a heated debate about something incredibly important. Anne herself is a fascinating, complex figure. She is intelligent, articulate, and fiercely independent, qualities that both attracted and eventually, arguably threatened Henry. She isn't afraid to speak her mind even to the king, which was a novelty he probably found refreshing at first. An odd, somewhat charming fact is that Anne Boleyn is credited with popularizing the French hood in England, a more elegant and revealing style of headdress compared to the heavier, traditional English gable hood worn by Catherine of Aragon. It was a small but visible symbol of her sophistication and her challenge to the old order. Fashion as a political statement, some things never change. As Pope Clement VII continues to prevaricate, caught between the Emperor Charles V and the increasingly impatient English king, Henry's resolve hardens. If the Pope will not grant him what he desires, then the Pope's authority in England must be curtailed, or even extinguished. Anne's presence, her refusal to be a mere concubine, and her reformist sympathies all push Henry further down this radical path. Historians still debate the precise nature and depth of Anne's religious convictions. Was she a genuinely pious reformer, or did she cannily use religious arguments to advance her personal and political ambitions, aligning herself with the new learning to secure her position? It's likely a complex mix of both, as human motivations rarely fit into neat little boxes. What is undeniable is her influence. She is not just waiting for Henry to clear the path to the throne. She is an active participant in the process, encouraging him, advising him, perhaps even daring him to take the final, irrevocable steps. You see her at court, increasingly treated as if she were already queen, her confidence growing even as the international condemnation of Henry's actions mounts. She is pregnant, a crucial development that adds even more urgency to the king's desire to legitimize their union and any child she might bear. The path to queenship is almost clear, paved with broken papal allegiances and the resolute ambition of both Anne and her determined king. The air is thick with the scent of change, a revolutionary wind blowing through the ancient halls of English power. The revolutionary wind you felt rising in the previous section is now a full-blown gale, sweeping away centuries of tradition and reshaping the spiritual and political landscape of England. The path to Anne Boleyn's queenship, once a risky and uncertain track, has been bulldozed clear by the sheer force of Henry's will. You are now standing on the cusp of a monumental change, a moment when England pivots, decisively and irrevocably, away from papal authority. The quiet negotiations and frustrated pleas to Rome are over. The time for action, for outright defiance, has arrived. The key figure orchestrating this seismic shift now that Cardinal Wolsey is gone, disgraced and dead, his vast wealth forfeited to the crown, is Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell is a man of humble origins, a lawyer, a brilliant administrator, and a political pragmatist of the highest order. He is to Henry what a master software engineer is to a demanding CEO with a radical new app idea, the one who can actually figure out the code to make it work. While Henry has the vision, or the obsession, depending on your point of view, Cromwell has the intellect and the ruthlessness to translate that into legal and political reality. You observe him, a quiet, watchful presence amidst the more flamboyant courtiers, his mind always several steps ahead. He's not flashy, not like Wolsey with his ostentatious displays, but he's arguably far more effective in achieving Henry's ultimate aims. He's the guy in the background making sure the entire enterprise doesn't collapse under its own audacious weight. Through a series of carefully crafted acts of parliament, driven by Cromwell and backed by a king who will not be denied, the power of the Pope in England is systematically dismantled. The Act in Restraint of Appeals in 1533 is a crucial turning point. It declares that England is an empire governed by one supreme head and king, and that all spiritual and temporal matters are to be determined within the realm without recourse to any foreign authority, meaning pointedly the Pope. This effectively severs the main legal artery connecting England to Rome. It's like England unilaterally unfriending the papacy on a global social media platform and then blocking them for good measure. Then, with Queen Catherine of Aragon effectively sidelined, declared by English ecclesiastical courts, now under Henry's thumb, thanks to new appointments like Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury, to have never been lawfully married to Henry, the way is clear. Henry secretly marries a pregnant Anne Boleyn in January 1533. Later that year, Cranmer formally declares Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void, and his marriage to Anne valid. Princess Mary is declared illegitimate, and her place as heir is taken by Anne's expected child. This is a profound and deeply controversial act, sending shockwaves across Catholic Europe and creating deep divisions within England itself. The culmination of this legislative revolution is the Act of Supremacy in 1534. It's an authoritative historical fact that the Act of Supremacy declared Henry the VIII and his successors the supreme head of the Church of England, giving the monarch ultimate authority over doctrine, appointments, and church governance. This isn't just a political maneuver, it's a theological one. The king is now, in essence, England's pope. This grants Henry the power he craved, the power to control his own marital destiny, certainly, but also immense power over the church's considerable wealth and influence within his kingdom. Think of it as a hostile takeover of a very large, very old, and very rich corporation, with the CEO not only seizing all assets, but also rewriting the company's mission statement. This doesn't happen without opposition, of course. Many devout Catholics are horrified. Prominent figures like Sir Thomas More, Henry's former Lord Chancellor and a renowned scholar, and Bishop John Fisher refuse to accept the king's supremacy over the church or the invalidity of his marriage to Catherine. Their principled stand costs them their lives. Both are executed for treason, becoming martyrs for the Catholic cause. Their deaths send a chilling message. Loyalty to the king now means loyalty to his new religious settlement, and dissent will not be tolerated. You can imagine the fear rippling through the corridors of power, the hushed conversations about who might be next if they don't publicly toe the new line. An odd, perhaps underappreciated aspect of this period is the sheer volume of propaganda, pamphlets, sermons, official pronouncements, generated to justify the king's actions to the English people and to the wider world. The printing press, a relatively new technology, becomes a powerful tool in shaping public opinion, or at least in attempting to. It's a concerted effort to sell this radical break as a necessary and righteous step, a restoration of ancient royal rights rather than a revolutionary innovation. Spin doctoring, it seems, has a long and venerable history. Historians still debate the degree to which these changes were driven by Henry's personal desires versus genuine religious reformist zeal within England, or Cromwell's own agenda for a more efficient, centralized state. Was Henry simply using the language of reform to achieve his dynastic aims, or did he come to believe in his own spiritual authority? Was Cromwell a proto-Protestant, or a supremely gifted administrator seizing an opportunity to increase royal power and streamline government? The answer, as is so often the case in history, is likely a complex tapestry woven from all these threads. What is clear is that England is now on a fundamentally different course. The new Church of England, while still largely Catholic in its doctrines and rituals at this initial stage, Henry was, remember, a theological conservative in many ways, is now answerable to the king, not to Rome. Anne Boleyn is queen, crowned with great ceremony, and in September 1533 she gives birth. The child, however, is not the longed-for son, but another daughter, Elizabeth. A disappointment, certainly, but for now Anne's position seems secure. The king has his annulment, his new queen, and his new church. The old order has been shattered. The echoes of that shattering will resonate for centuries. The echoes of that shattering, the establishment of the Church of England, with Henry as its supreme head, are still reverberating. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom, in many ways, all this turmoil was unleashed, sits beside Henry on the throne. She has achieved her great ambition. She is Queen of England. You observe her in her new role, adorned in the magnificent jewels and gowns befitting her station. But beneath the regal trappings, the confidence you saw earlier is perhaps a little brittler. The triumph feels precarious. The birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, while a healthy child, was not the son so desperately needed to secure the Tudor succession and, more personally for Anne, her own position. The court atmosphere, always a complex web of alliances and rivalries, is now even more treacherous. Anne has her supporters, those who have benefited from the religious changes and her rise. But she also has powerful enemies, those loyal to the memory of Queen Catherine and Princess Mary, those who resent the Boleyn family's influence, and those who genuinely fear the break with Rome is a pathway to damnation. Anne herself is not a woman who inspires neutral feelings. Her sharp intelligence, her outspokenness, and her sometimes arrogant demeanor, qualities that initially intrigued Henry, begin to grate on him and on others. She doesn't suffer fools gladly, and in a royal court there are always plenty of those to not suffer. One might say her personal brand of telling it like it is wasn't always well received in an era that preferred a bit more diplomatic sugarcoating, especially from a queen. Henry, having moved heaven and earth, and the Pope, to marry her, now finds his infatuation cooling. He is still desperate for a male heir. Anne has further pregnancies, but they end in miscarriages, including one of a male child, a devastating blow. The king, a man of enormous ego and deep-seated insecurities about his dynasty, starts to wonder if this marriage, too, is cursed. His scruples of conscience, so loudly proclaimed regarding Catherine of Aragon, could easily be repurposed. If God had withheld a son from his first marriage because it was unlawful in his eyes, perhaps his second marriage was similarly displeasing. It's a convenient theology when you're an absolute monarch looking for an exit strategy. Whispers and accusations begin to circulate around Anne. Given the king's clear frustration and wandering eye, those who wished Anne ill saw their opportunity. Thomas Cromwell, who had been instrumental in Anne's rise, now sees her as a political liability. perhaps even a threat to his own position and the stability of the reforms he is engineering. He is a pragmatist, remember. When the king's favor shifts, so too must the allegiances of those who wish to survive. It's like being in a very high-stakes reality TV show where alliances change weekly, and one bad performance review from the main judge means you're off the island, or, in this case, off with your head. Suddenly, shockingly, Anne is arrested in May 1536. The charges are breathtaking. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, incest, and plotting to kill the king. It is an authoritative historical fact that the evidence used to convict Anne Boleyn and the accused men was flimsy, largely based on coerced confessions, circumstantial accounts, and a general atmosphere of manufactured hysteria. Most historians today believe she was innocent of these specific charges, the victim of a political conspiracy orchestrated to remove her. The speed of her downfall is terrifying. One day queen, the next a prisoner in the Tower of London, the very place she had awaited her coronation just 3 years earlier. The trials are a mockery of justice. Anne defends herself with intelligence and dignity, but the outcome is predetermined. She is found guilty, as are her accused lovers, including the talented court musician Mark Smeaton, whose confession was likely extracted under torture, and prominent courtiers like Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, and William Brereton, as well as her brother. They are all condemned to death. The charge of incest with her brother is particularly scandalous and designed to blacken her name irrevocably. An odd, rather poignant detail is that on the scaffold, Anne Boleyn reportedly praised the king, calling him a gentle and merciful prince, a statement often interpreted as a final, desperate attempt to protect her daughter Elizabeth from the repercussions of her own fate. Or perhaps it was heavy, heavy sarcasm. One can only imagine. Within days of Anne's execution by a skilled swordsman brought specially from France, a small mercy perhaps, as beheading by axe could be a horribly botched affair, Henry is betrothed to Jane Seymour. Jane had been a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, a quiet, seemingly demure contrast to Anne's fiery personality. Historians still debate the extent to which Jane Seymour and her family actively plotted Anne's downfall or simply positioned themselves to benefit from it as the king's affections for Anne waned. Was Jane a passive recipient of the king's favor, or a more astute player in the deadly game of court politics than her meek demeanor suggested? Anne Boleyn is beheaded on Tower Hill on May 19, 1536. Her marriage to Henry is annulled just before her death, and her daughter Elizabeth, like Mary before her, is declared illegitimate. The cycle of hope, marriage, disappointment, and brutal resolution seems to be setting a grim pattern. You are left with the image of a king who, having defied the entire Christian world to win one queen, discards her with chilling ruthlessness when she fails to deliver the one thing he prizes above all, a son. The golden prince you once saw jousting so joyfully is hardening, his capacity for cruelty becoming starkly apparent. The quest for an heir has become a deadly obsession, and the throne of England a very dangerous seat, especially for those who share it with Henry. The swiftness of Jane Seymour's rise, even as Anne's blood is barely dry on the scaffold, speaks volumes about the king's singular focus. The grim shadow of Anne Boleyn's execution still hangs heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the king's absolute power and the perilous nature of royal favor, yet the court, ever adaptable, quickly adjusts to the new reality. Just 11 days after Anne's beheading, a period that hardly allows for even a polite pause in the royal marital marathon, Henry VIII marries Jane Seymour. You observe the transition. The dark velvets of mourning, if any were even worn for Anne, are quickly replaced by the hopeful pastels and golds signifying a new queen and, everyone fervently hopes, a new chance for a legitimate male heir. Jane is in almost every way Anne's opposite. Where Anne was vivacious, outspoken, and a champion of religious reform, Jane is quiet, submissive, and presents an image of placid traditionalism. Her motto is bound to obey and serve, a far cry from Anne's more assertive persona. This, it seems, is exactly what Henry now desires. He's had his fill of fiery, intelligent women who challenge him. He craves peace, obedience, and above all, a son. Jane, with her calm demeanor and perceived gentleness, seems to promise all three. It's like after a tumultuous relationship with a high-maintenance sports car that kept breaking down in very public and embarrassing ways, Henry has opted for a sensible, reliable minivan. Perhaps not as thrilling, but far more likely to get him where he needs to go, namely the secure continuation of his dynasty. The Seymour family naturally rises to prominence. Jane's brothers Edward and Thomas become influential figures at court, benefiting greatly from their sister's elevation. They are shrewd politicians who understand that their family's fortunes are now inextricably linked to Jane's ability to produce a healthy male child. The pressure on Jane is immense, though perhaps she carries it with more outward composure than Anne did. You see her presiding over a court that is deliberately less flamboyant, less overtly intellectual than Anne's. The focus is on traditional piety, domesticity, and the quiet expectation of the patter of tiny royal, and preferably male, feet. And then, in October 1537, after 18 months of marriage, Jane fulfills the hope that has consumed Henry for over 2 decades. She gives birth to a son, Prince Edward. The joy throughout the kingdom is immense, almost hysterical. Church bells ring, bonfires are lit, and celebratory services are held. Henry is ecstatic, overwhelmed with relief and paternal pride. It's an authoritative historical fact that the birth of Prince Edward was a moment of profound personal and dynastic triumph for Henry VIII, finally securing a legitimate male heir to the Tudor throne after years of political and religious upheaval undertaken to achieve this very goal. This is the culmination of everything: the annulment from Catherine, the break with Rome, the executions, the political machinations. It all, in Henry's mind, is now justified. He has his son. The christening of Prince Edward is a magnificent affair, a display of royal splendor and dynastic security. Even Henry's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had both been declared illegitimate, are given roles in the ceremony, a tentative sign of their possible partial rehabilitation. Mary is Edward's godmother. Elizabeth carries the chrism, the baptismal cloth. It's a carefully managed public display of Tudor family unity, even if that unity is paper-thin and dictated entirely by the king's will. But the joy is tragically short-lived. Just 12 days after giving birth, Queen Jane Seymour dies. The cause is likely puerperal fever or childbed fever, a common and often fatal infection in an age before antibiotics and proper sanitation. An odd and rather sad fact is that despite the immense wealth and power of the Tudor monarchy, basic hygiene particularly in childbirth, was poorly understood, making even royal mothers highly vulnerable to postpartum infections. It's a sobering reminder that all the silks and jewels in the kingdom couldn't protect against the dangers of bringing a new life into the world. Imagine the state of a 16th century delivery room, even a royal one. Probably not somewhere you'd want to eat your lunch, let alone have a baby. Henry is genuinely devastated by Jane's death. Of all his wives, she is the one he seems to have loved most sincerely, or at least the one whose loss he mourned most deeply. She had given him his longed-for son, the ultimate gift in his eyes, and then she was cruelly snatched away. He orders a lavish funeral for her and declares that she is the only one of his wives he will be buried beside, a wish that would eventually be honored. He refers to her as his only true wife, the one who had finally succeeded where others had failed. Historians still debate the nature of Henry's affection for Jane. Was it genuine love or profound gratitude for her success in providing an heir colored by the tragic circumstances of her death? Her quiet, submissive nature might have appealed to him after the perceived difficulties with Catherine and Anne, offering him a sense of domestic peace he hadn't known. The court is plunged into mourning. But even in grief, the dynastic reality reasserts itself. Henry has his heir, yes, but Prince Edward is just an infant. Infant mortality rates are terrifyingly high. The king needs more sons, spares for the heir to ensure the Tudor line. The realm cannot afford for the succession to rest on a single, fragile life. And so, even as Jane Seymour is laid to rest, the political machinery, though perhaps after a more respectful pause this time, will begin to grind once more. The search for a fourth queen will, in due course, commence. The brief interlude of joy and relief has been cruelly cut short, replaced by sorrow, but underscored, as always, by the relentless pressure of dynastic survival. For now, a baby boy sleeps in the royal nursery, unaware of the immense hopes and fears that rest upon his tiny shoulders, or the mother he will never know. The genuine grief Henry felt for Jane Seymour, the wife who finally gave him his longed-for son, slowly begins to recede, or at least is pushed aside by the relentless demands of kingship and the Tudor dynasty's insatiable need for security. Little Prince Edward is thriving, but he's still just one small boy in a world rife with disease and uncertainty. The counselors, especially the ever-pragmatic Thomas Cromwell, gently, or perhaps not so gently, begin to press upon Henry the necessity of remarrying. Another son, a spare heir, would immeasurably strengthen the succession. The king, now in his late 40s and showing the early signs of the physical decline that will mark his later years, is not as averse to the idea as his earlier romantic image might suggest. Marriage for Henry is now less about passion and more about politics and procreation. You sense a shift in the criteria for a queen. It's less about personal attraction and more about international alliances and fertile childbearing hips. A bit like shopping for a new car based purely on safety ratings and cargo space, rather than whether it looks cool. The geopolitical situation in Europe is, as ever, a tangled mess. Francis I of France and Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, are perpetually at each other's throats, or occasionally forming uneasy alliances that threaten England. Cromwell, the architect of the English Reformation and Henry's chief minister, sees an opportunity to forge a Protestant alliance to counterbalance the Catholic powers. He looks towards the Protestant princes of Germany and specifically to the Duchy of Cleves. The Duke of Cleves has a sister, Anne, and another, Amelia, who are of marriageable age. A match with Cleves could bring valuable allies and bolster the Protestant cause in England, which Cromwell is keen to advance. Portraits are commissioned. Hans Holbein the Younger, the brilliant court painter, is dispatched to paint Anne and Amelia of Cleves. It's an authoritative historical fact that Holbein's portrait of Anne of Cleves, which still survives, depicts her as quite comely, with a gentle, modest expression. Henry, relying on this portrait and the glowing reports from his ambassadors, who were perhaps a little too eager to please Cromwell and secure the alliance, agrees to the match with Anne. She is Protestant, she comes from a strategically useful family, and her portrait suggests she's perfectly acceptable. What could go wrong? Well, as anyone who's ever been on a blind date based on a 10-year-old profile picture knows, quite a lot. Anne of Cleves arrives in England in late 1539. Henry, ever the romantic, or perhaps just impatient, decides to surprise her by meeting her incognito at Rochester before her formal state entry into London. He bursts into her chambers, disguised, expecting her to be overcome by his charm and immediately recognize his kingly presence, a scene straight out of a chivalric romance. Anne, however, who speaks no English and is thoroughly bewildered by this boisterous, heavy-set, middle-aged stranger. Henry is no longer the slender golden prince of his youth, fails to react as scripted. She is reportedly polite, but distinctly unimpressed. Henry, his ego bruised, is immediately disappointed. He finds her plain, lacking in the sophisticated graces he expected, and he famously complains to Cromwell, rather indelicately, that she is no better than a Flanders or charming. Despite Henry's very vocal misgivings, "I like her not, I like her not," the marriage contract is signed, and the wedding proceeds in January 1540. The alliance is too important politically to back out of at this late stage without causing a major diplomatic incident. You can imagine the wedding feast, Henry sulking in his soup, Anne trying her best to look queenly while probably wondering what on earth she's gotten herself into, and Cromwell sweating profusely, hoping the whole thing doesn't blow up in his face. It's the royal equivalent of an incredibly awkward office Christmas party, where the CEO clearly despises the new high-profile hire he was talked into. The marriage is, by all accounts, a disaster from the start, at least in Henry's eyes. It is almost certainly unconsummated. Henry complains bitterly that he cannot bring himself to perform his duty with Anne. An odd, though perhaps understandable detail is Anne's reported lack of understanding of marital relations. She supposedly told her ladies-in-waiting after her wedding night that the king had kissed her and bid her good night, and surely that was sufficient for marriage. This naivety, whether real or feigned, likely did little to endear her to a king already disinclined. Cromwell is in an increasingly desperate position. He had championed this marriage, staked his reputation on its success. Now, with Henry thoroughly unhappy and the international political situation shifting once again, Charles V and Francis IV making peace, diminishing the immediate need for the Cleves alliance, Cromwell's enemies at court, particularly the conservative faction led by the Duke of Norfolk, see their chance to bring him down. They blame him for the failed marriage and, more dangerously, accuse him of heresy and treason for pushing the Protestant Reformation too far, too fast. Historians still debate the precise combination of factors that led to Cromwell's sudden and brutal fall. Was it primarily the Anne of Cleves debacle, Henry's volatile temper, the machinations of the conservative faction, or Cromwell's own sometimes heavy-handed implementation of religious reforms that alienated key nobles? It was likely all of these, a perfect storm that overwhelmed even a politician as astute as Cromwell. In a stunningly swift reversal of fortune, Thomas Cromwell, the man who had steered England through the break with Rome and arguably been the most powerful man in England after the king for a decade, is arrested in June 1540. He is condemned without trial by an act of attainder, a grimly ironic use of a legal tool he himself had often employed against others. He is executed on Tower Hill in July 1540, the same day Henry marries his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. The diplomatic match with Anne of Cleves has not only failed to secure an alliance, it has cost Henry his most able minister. Anne, meanwhile, wisely agrees to an annulment, accepts a generous settlement, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, Anne Boleyn's childhood home, a slightly awkward hand-me-down, and is given the honorary title of the King's beloved sister. She lives out her days comfortably in England, outliving Henry and all his other wives. Perhaps in the end she had the last laugh, albeit a quiet German one. The execution of Thomas Cromwell, the architect of so much of Henry's revolution, marks another turning point. The brief, awkward interlude with Anne of Cleves, the king's beloved sister, as she's now rather diplomatically known, is officially over, annulled with surprising ease, all things considered. Anne, bless her practical German heart, seems perfectly content to trade the perilous title of Queen for a comfortable retirement package. Henry, however, is not one to remain single for long. On the very same day that Cromwell lost his head, Henry marries his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. You can almost feel the whiplash as the court pivots from one queenly regime to another. The scent of Cromwell's blood barely faded before the wedding bells ring out anew. It's like the kingdom is on a speed dating show hosted by a very impatient, very powerful monarch. Catherine Howard is a stark contrast to Anne of Cleves. She is young, probably still in her late teens, though her exact birth date is uncertain, making her potentially 30 years Henry's junior. She is vivacious, pretty, and by all accounts not overly burdened with intellect or education, unlike some of Henry's previous, more formidable wives. She is a cousin to Anne Boleyn, both being from the powerful Howard family, led by the staunchly conservative Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Cromwell's old adversary. With Cromwell out of the picture, the conservative faction is ascendant at court, and Catherine's marriage to the king solidifies their influence. It's a return to a more traditional Catholic-leaning atmosphere, although Henry himself remains firmly the supreme head of his own church. Thank you very much. Henry, now increasingly overweight, plagued by painful ulcers on his legs, and no longer the athletic golden prince, is utterly besotted with his youthful bride. She makes him feel young again. He lavishes her with jewels and gifts, calling her his rose without a thorn, his very jewel of womanhood. After the perceived plainness and seriousness of Anne of Cleves, Catherine's giggling, flirtatious charm is a breath of fresh air to the aging king. He seems genuinely happy, almost giddy. You might imagine him showing off his pretty young wife at court, beaming with a slightly desperate pride, perhaps conveniently forgetting the vast age gap and the ever-present specter of his own mortality. It's the classic tale of the older, powerful man captivated by a vivacious younger woman, a story as old as time, though in this case, the stakes are considerably higher than just a messy divorce. Catherine, however, is a product of a rather lax upbringing within the Howard household. Before her marriage to the king, she had engaged in several indiscreet romantic dalliances. It's an authoritative historical fact that prior to her marriage, Catherine Howard had a sexual relationship with her music teacher, Henry Mannix, and a more serious affair with a young kinsman, Francis Derham, to whom she may even have been pre-contracted, a form of betrothal that could, in some circumstances, be considered a valid marriage. These were dangerous secrets to bring into a royal marriage, especially with a king as paranoid and sensitive about his honor as Henry. She was, to put it mildly, playing with fire, and her understanding of just how hot that fire could burn seemed remarkably limited. The court of Henry VIII. It is, as you've seen, a snake pit of ambition and intrigue. Those who were out of favor when Catherine Howard rose to prominence are constantly looking for ways to regain their footing. And Catherine, in her youthful naivety and perhaps a touch of arrogance, makes some catastrophically poor choices. She appoints Francis Dereham, her former lover, as her private secretary. She also begins a flirtation, which likely escalated into a full-blown affair with one of Henry's favorite courtiers, Thomas Culpeper, a young man known for his charm and his rather reckless behavior. It's like she's actively trying to collect the entire set of bad decisions Monopoly cards. These indiscretions do not go unnoticed. Whispers start. An odd, or perhaps just telling detail is that much of the information about Catherine's past and her current activities came from disgruntled former members of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household, where Catherine had lived before coming to court. People who knew her history and perhaps had scores to settle or favors to curry with the opposing factions. The walls in Tudor palaces always had ears, and often very chatty mouths. While Henry is blissfully unaware, enjoying his apparent marital felicity, a net is slowly closing around his young queen. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a man who had navigated the treacherous waters of Henry's earlier marital dramas and religious reforms, receives information about Catherine's premarital activities and her ongoing affair with Culpeper. Cranmer is in a terrible position. He knows the king's explosive temper, especially when it comes to matters of his wife's fidelity. To inform the king is to risk his fury. To conceal it is to risk being implicated in treason himself. Historians still debate the precise motivations of those who brought the information forward. Was it a genuine concern for the king and the succession, a desire to unseat the Howard faction, or a combination of both? Politics and personal morality were, as always, deeply intertwined. Cranmer, after much soul-searching and probably a few sleepless nights, decides he must inform the king. The stage is set for another royal drama, one that will end, like others before it, in tragedy and bloodshed. Catherine Howard's brief, glittering moment as Henry's rose without a thorn is about to come to a very thorny end. The king's delight will turn to incandescent rage, and the perilous court games will claim another victim. You can almost hear the soft, rustling sound of her expensive silks, a sound soon to be replaced by the much grimmer echoes of the tower. The blissful ignorance Henry had been enjoying, wrapped in the illusion of youthful love provided by his fifth queen, Catherine Howard, is about to be violently shattered. Archbishop Cranmer, armed with damning evidence of Catherine's past indiscretions and her current dangerous liaisons, makes the fateful decision to inform the king. You can imagine the scene. Cranmer, a man who usually projected an air of scholarly calm, nervously presenting a letter to Henry detailing the accusations. The king at first refuses to believe it. This is his rose without a thorn, his jewel of womanhood. Surely it's all just malicious slander from her enemies. He orders an investigation, perhaps still hoping to disprove the allegations. But the evidence, when systematically gathered, is overwhelming. Henry Mannix and Francis Dereham, Catherine's premarital lovers, are interrogated. Dereham, under duress and probably the not-so-gentle persuasion of Tudor-era enhanced interrogation techniques, confesses to his prior relationship with Catherine, and also implicates Thomas Culpeper in an affair with the Queen. Lady Rochford, Jane Boleyn, widow of Anne Boleyn's executed brother, George, and a lady-in-waiting who had facilitated Catherine's secret meetings with Culpeper, is also arrested and questioned. Her testimony is crucial in confirming the Queen's infidelity during her marriage to Henry. It seems Lady Rochford had a rather unfortunate knack for being associated with queens who ended up on the chopping block. Perhaps she should have considered a career change, something less royally adjacent. When confronted with the proof, Henry's initial disbelief turns into a volcanic eruption of rage and self-pity. He reportedly weeps, rails against his ill fortune in marriage, and calls for a sword to kill Catherine himself. This isn't just about a broken heart. It's about his honor, his royal dignity, and the profound humiliation of being cuckolded, yet again, by a wife for whom he had, in his own way, cared deeply. His reaction is terrifying. The aging king, already plagued by ill health and a volatile temper, is pushed to his limits. You sense his paranoia, which has always lurked beneath the surface, now taking a firmer hold. Who could he trust? His court seemed to be a nest of vipers, his wives a succession of betrayers. Catherine Howard, when the accusations are put to her, apparently collapses in hysterics. Unlike Anne Boleyn, who faced her accusers with articulate defiance, Catherine seems to unravel completely. She is young, terrified, and utterly out of her depth. She confesses to her premarital relationships, but denies adultery with Culpeper after her marriage, though the evidence strongly suggests otherwise. It's an authoritative historical fact that both Thomas Culpeper and Francis Derham were executed in December 1541 for treason. Derham was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a particularly brutal punishment, while Culpeper, as a nobleman, was granted the mercy of being beheaded. Their heads were displayed on London Bridge as a grim warning. Catherine herself is stripped of her title of queen and imprisoned, first at Sion Abbey, and then in the Tower of London, that all-too-familiar final stop for Henry's discarded wives. An odd and deeply melancholic detail often recounted is that Catherine supposedly spent hours practicing laying her head on the executioner's block in her tower rooms, preparing for her end. Whether this is a romanticized embellishment or a grim reality, it paints a pathetic picture of a young woman facing an inexorable fate. An Act of Attainder is passed against her in Parliament, condemning her to death for treason without the need for a full trial. This was a convenient legal shortcut Henry was becoming rather fond of when dealing with inconvenient people. Her past, her foolish choices, and the political machinations of the court have sealed her doom. Historians still debate the degree of Catherine's actual guilt regarding post-marital adultery with Culpeper. While a flirtation and secret meetings are certain, was the affair fully consummated, or was the evidence exaggerated to ensure her condemnation? Given the stakes and the king's fury, any hint of impropriety was likely magnified into undeniable proof of treasonous misconduct. It's hard to imagine anyone daring to defend her, or even suggesting a lesser punishment, when the king was in such a state. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard, barely out of her teens, is led to the scaffold on Tower Green, the same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had met her end less than 6 years earlier. She reportedly meets her fate with a degree of composure, though her youth and the tragic circumstances of her downfall evoke a certain pity, even from contemporary chroniclers who were hardly sympathetic to fallen women. Lady Rochford, her accomplice, is executed immediately afterwards. Henry is now a twice widowed, twice divorced, if you count Anne of Cleves' annulment as a divorce, which, practically speaking, it was, king. His record with wives is, to put it mildly, abysmal. His paranoia deepens. His health continues to decline, his once athletic frame now hugely overweight, his legs oozing from painful ulcers, making him increasingly immobile and short-tempered. The Golden Prince is long gone, replaced by a suspicious, ailing tyrant. The court walks on eggshells around him. He makes it clear he has had enough of youthful, flighty queens. His next wife, if there is to be one, will need to be of a very different character. The trauma of Catherine Howard's betrayal casts a long, dark shadow over his remaining years, reinforcing his worst fears about women and loyalty. The quest for an heir had been achieved, but the quest for marital stability, or even just basic reliability, had proven a spectacular failure. The dark shadow of Catherine Howard's execution, a stark testament to the king's brutal response to perceived betrayal, lingers over the court. Henry, now well into his 50s, is a changed man from the vibrant youth you first encountered. He is physically deteriorating, his jousting injuries from years past now contributing to severe mobility issues, his enormous girth making him a prisoner in his own ailing body. His temper, never the most stable, is now notoriously unpredictable. You find yourself in a court that is more subdued, more cautious. The giddy excitement that Catherine Howard briefly brought is gone, replaced by a wary vigilance. No one wants to be the next to trigger a royal explosion. One imagines courtiers practicing their most unobtrusive, wallflower-like demeanors. For over a year after Catherine's execution, Henry remains unmarried. Perhaps he is wary, perhaps even emotionally exhausted by the betrayals and dramas. Or, perhaps more pragmatically, the right candidate simply hadn't presented herself, or the political climate wasn't quite right for another matrimonial venture. But the need for a queen remains. Not necessarily for more heirs, as Prince Edward, though still young, is growing and appears healthy. Rather, Henry needs a consort, a companion in his declining years, someone to manage his household, and, crucially, someone to act as a kind and stable influence for his 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, whose lives have been so disrupted by their father's tumultuous marital history. It's less about a passionate romance and more about finding a competent and calming presence, a sort of royal nurse/stepmother with excellent references. Enter Catherine Parr. She is not a blushing teenager like Catherine Howard, nor a foreign princess like Anne of Cleves or Catherine of Aragon. She is an English gentlewoman, twice widowed herself, in her early 30s when she catches the king's eye. She is intelligent, devout, and possessed of a calm, sensible demeanor. She comes from a respectable gentry family, and her previous marriages mean she is experienced in managing a household and presumably a husband. You see her as a woman of quiet dignity, with a notable interest in the new religious learning, a point that will both attract Henry and later put her in considerable danger. Henry proposes to Catherine Parr in 1543, and they marry in July of that year at Hampton Court Palace. It is a relatively quiet affair, certainly not on the lavish scale of some of his earlier weddings. Catherine Parr is his 6th and, as it will turn out, final wife. Her motto, "To be useful in all I do," reflects her practical and perhaps somewhat cautious approach to her new role. She understands she is not marrying the romantic hero of her youth, but an aging ailing, and often difficult monarch. It's not a fairy tale, it's a job, and a rather dangerous one at that, given the track record of her predecessors. You have to admire her courage, or perhaps her pragmatic assessment of the opportunities and risks. Being Queen of England, even to a grouchy Henry, probably beat being a twice-widowed gentlewoman of modest means. One of Catherine Parr's most significant achievements as queen is her role in reuniting Henry with his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. It's an authoritative historical fact that Catherine Parr actively worked to improve the relationship between Henry and his daughters and was instrumental in getting them restored to the line of succession, after Prince Edward, of course, through the Act of Succession of 1543, ratified 1544. This was a crucial step in stabilizing the Tudor dynasty and providing a clearer path should anything happen to Edward. She fostered a more harmonious family atmosphere, acting as a kind stepmother to all three of Henry's children, who clearly benefited from her care and attention. She encouraged their education, particularly Elizabeth's, and created a sense of stability that had been sorely lacking. Catherine is also a woman of deep religious conviction, with strong sympathies towards the ongoing Reformation. She is learned, reads Scripture in its original languages, and even writes and publishes her own religious devotional works, such as prayers or meditations. This is quite remarkable for a woman of her time, let alone a queen consort. An odd, or perhaps inspiring fact is that Catherine Parr was the first Queen of England to publish a book under her own name. She surrounded herself with reform-minded scholars and ladies-in-waiting, and engaged in theological discussions, even with the king himself. This intellectual and religious independence, however, is a dangerous path to tread with a king as arrogant and opinionated on matters of faith as Henry. Historians still debate the extent to which Catherine Parr's reformist activities genuinely endangered her. Was she truly close to being arrested and charged with heresy, as some accounts suggest, or were these threats exaggerated by later Protestant hagiographers to emphasize her piety and peril? There is evidence that her conservative enemies at court, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, did indeed try to turn the king against her, accusing her of heresy for her reformist views and her willingness to debate theology with him, something Henry, who considered himself the ultimate theological authority in England, found increasingly irksome. According to one famous, though perhaps embellished, story, an arrest warrant was actually drawn up for Catherine. She supposedly got wind of it, wisely threw herself on the king's mercy, apologized for daring to debate with him, saying she only did it to distract him from the pain of his leg and to learn from his wisdom, and thus skillfully diffused the situation. Henry, mollified, forgave her and rebuked her accusers. Whether this dramatic tale is entirely accurate or not, it highlights the constant danger faced by even a sensible and devoted queen in Henry's court. One wrong step, one theological debate too many, and she could find herself following the path of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Catherine Parr's great skill was her ability to navigate these perilous waters, providing care and companionship to the aging king while subtly promoting her own religious agenda and protecting her household. She was, in many ways, the ultimate survivor among Henry's wives. The quiet competence and calming influence of Catherine Parr are a stark contrast to the increasing physical decay of the king she cares for. You are now observing Henry VIII. Bathed in his final years, a far cry from the athletic Golden Prince, or even the somewhat portly but still vigorous monarch who broke with Rome. The man who bestrode his world like a colossus is now largely confined to his chambers, his massive frame a source of constant pain and frustration. The energy that once fueled tournaments, hunts, and continental wars is now consumed by the battle against his own failing body. His physical deterioration is dramatic. It's an authoritative historical fact that by the end of his life, Henry VIII's waist measurement was reputed to be around 54 inches, and he may have weighed close to 400 pounds, around 180 kilograms. He suffered from severe gout, which inflamed his joints, and the chronic suppurating ulcers on his legs, likely varicose ulcers that became infected, caused him excruciating pain and emitted a foul odor that even the heavy perfumes of the court could not entirely mask. Moving him required mechanical contraptions, a sort of early hoist, a humbling reality for a man who prided himself on his physical strength. Imagine the sheer effort involved in just getting the king out of bed or into a chair. It would have been a major daily operation involving numerous strong attendants. This physical decline undoubtedly impacted his temper, which was already legendary for its volatility. His pain often made him irascible, suspicious, and prone to violent outbursts of rage. Courtiers lived in fear of displeasing him. Even Catherine Parr, for all her skill in managing him, had that very close call with the arrest warrant, a chilling reminder that no one was entirely safe from his displeasure. He was surrounded by factions vying for influence, particularly as it became clear that his reign was drawing to a close, and the question of who would control the minority government of his young son Edward became paramount. The Seymours, Prince Edward's uncles, were on one side, and the conservative Howards, though somewhat diminished after Catherine Howard's fall, and their allies on the other. It was a tense, uneasy atmosphere, like waiting for a storm to break. Despite his ailments, Henry's mind, when not clouded by pain or paranoia, remained sharp. He continued to involve himself in matters of state, dictating letters, meeting with counselors, and making crucial decisions about the future of his kingdom. He launched one last, rather pointless and expensive, war against France in the mid-1540s, even personally overseeing the siege of Boulogne for a time, though his participation was largely symbolic from a specially constructed vantage point. It was a final, faint echo of the warrior king he had once aspired to be. One wonders if, in his more lucid moments, he reflected on the vast changes his reign had wrought, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, the establishment of the Church of England, and whether he felt satisfaction or perhaps a degree of apprehension about the legacy he would leave. An odd and perhaps surprisingly modern aspect of Henry's later years was his reliance on physicians and their various remedies, many of which sound bizarre to our ears, but represented the cutting edge of Tudor medicine. Potions containing pearls or gold, complex herbal concoctions, bleeding and purging were all part of the medical arsenal. He also had a keen interest in clocks and scientific instruments, a testament to his earlier intellectual curiosity, which flickered even amidst his decline. It's almost as if he was trying to control time itself, or at least measure its passing with precision, as his own was clearly running out. The religious landscape remained unsettled. While Henry had broken with Rome and declared himself supreme head of the Church, the doctrine of the Church of England was still something of a hybrid, a Catholicism without the Pope in many respects, though reformist influences were gaining ground, particularly under the patronage of figures like Catherine Parr and Archbishop Cranmer. Historians still debate the true nature of Henry VIII's personal religious beliefs in his final years. Did he genuinely lean towards more Protestant doctrines, or was he fundamentally a traditional Catholic who merely rejected papal authority for political reasons, trying to hold a middle ground that was becoming increasingly untenable? His will, which we'll look at soon, offers some clues, but ambiguity remained. He persecuted radical Protestants, Anabaptists, for example, with the same fervor he showed towards those who stubbornly upheld papal supremacy. Consistency was not his strong suit, especially when it came to theology dictated by royal whim. You observe him now, perhaps seated in a heavily cushioned chair, his leg propped up, his face bloated, his eyes narrowed in suspicion or dulled by pain. The tapestries on the wall, depicting heroic scenes of hunt and battle, must have seemed like a cruel mockery of his present state. The vibrant silks and jewels of his court surround him, but they cannot disguise the reality of his decay. This is the man who had 6 wives, defied popes and emperors, and reshaped a nation. Now he is simply an old, sick man, albeit a very powerful and dangerous one, facing his own mortality. The once mighty oak is slowly, inexorably falling, and everyone around him is holding their breath, waiting for the final crash. The heavy, expectant hush you noticed around the ailing king deepens. It's clear to everyone in the inner circle at Greenwich Palace that Henry VIII's long and turbulent reign is finally drawing to its inevitable close. The once mighty oak is not just leaning, its roots are visibly failing. Winter has settled over England, and a corresponding chill of uncertainty permeates the royal apartments. You find yourself an almost invisible observer in these tense, hushed rooms, where the fate of a nation hangs on the flickering pulse of its dying monarch. As his physical strength wanes, Henry's focus, and that of his closest advisors, turns with increasing urgency to the future. The succession and the governance of the realm during his son Edward's minority. Prince Edward is only 9 years old. A child king means a regency council, and the composition and leadership of that council will determine the political and religious direction of England for years to come. The stakes could not be higher. The factions that have been jostling for position throughout Henry's later years, principally the reformist group led by Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, Prince Edward's uncle, and the more conservative faction, somewhat weakened but still present, are now engaged in a final, desperate struggle for influence over the king's last will and testament. Henry's will becomes the ultimate battleground. This document will not only name his successor, but also lay out the structure of the Regency Council. It's an authoritative historical fact that Henry VIII's final will, dated December 30th, 1546, though possibly signed later, a point of some contention, reaffirmed the line of succession established by the 1543 Act of Succession. First his son Edward, then his daughter Mary, and then his daughter Elizabeth. This inclusion of his daughters, though after Edward and his potential heirs, was a significant act, largely thanks to Catherine Parr's earlier influence, and it would, of course, have profound implications for England's future, leading eventually to the reigns of two of its most famous queens. It was, however, conditional on them not marrying without the consent of the Privy Council. No pressure, girls. The real wrangling, however, is over the makeup and powers of the Regency Council. Henry, in his typical autocratic fashion, seems to have intended a council of equals, with no single Lord Protector, perhaps fearing that one man might grow too powerful and usurp his son's authority. He named 16 executors to form this council. However, in the final days and hours, as Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, there were opportunities for those closest to him to influence the document, or at least its interpretation. An odd, almost sneaky detail is the use of the dry stamp, a replica of the king's signature that could be impressed onto documents and then inked in by an official. While a practical measure for a king too ill to sign a mountain of paperwork, it also opened the door to potential manipulation. Questions have always lingered about precisely when and by whom certain crucial clauses in the will were finalized or amended. Did Henry truly consent to every detail, or were some key decisions effectively made by those controlling access to him and his signature stamp in his last confused hours? The reformist faction, led by Seymour, clearly outmaneuvered their rivals in these final stages. Key conservatives like Bishop Stephen Gardiner and the Duke of Norfolk found themselves excluded or marginalized. Norfolk himself was arrested on trumped-up treason charges in December 1546, and his son, the poet Earl of Surrey, was executed in January 1547, just days before Henry's own death. This conveniently removed powerful opponents who might have challenged Seymour's dominance in the new government. It was a ruthless clearing of the decks, characteristic of the brutal politics of the Tudor court. The timing, just as the king was on his deathbed, feels particularly cynical. "Sorry, Duke. The king says you're a traitor. Nothing personal, just ensuring a smooth transition for the 9-year-old. As Henry's condition worsens, there's a reluctance among his attendants to tell him that his end is near. To speak of the king's death was technically treason. Who would dare be the one to inform the fearsome Henry VIII, that he was about to meet his maker? Eventually, Sir Anthony Denny, one of his chief gentlemen of the Privy Chamber and a man close to the reformist faction, takes it upon himself to gently inform the king that he is dying and should prepare himself. Henry, perhaps surprisingly, takes the news with a degree of composure. He is asked if he wishes to see any clergy. He says he will see Archbishop Cranmer, but not yet. He will sleep a little first. Historians still debate the spiritual state of Henry VIII at his death. Did he die a convinced reformer, a traditional Catholic who merely rejected the Pope, or a man somewhere in between, tormented by uncertainty? His will contains provisions for masses to be said for his soul, a traditionally Catholic practice, yet he had also approved increasingly reformist measures and personnel in his final years. His final significant religious act was to allow Cranmer to press his hand in lieu of a verbal confession or affirmation of faith, as he had by then lost the power of speech. This small gesture has been interpreted in various ways, but Cranmer at least seemed to believe it signified Henry's trust in salvation through Christ alone, a more Protestant leaning. The air in the king's chamber is thick with the anticipation of the inevitable. The realm outside holds its breath. Decrees have been made, the will ostensibly finalized, but until the king draws his last breath, nothing is truly certain. The future of England, the fate of the Reformation, the security of the Tudor dynasty, all hang precariously in the balance, resting on the final, faltering heartbeats of this extraordinary, terrifying, and profoundly consequential monarch. The final, faltering heartbeats you were just sensing have now ceased. It is the early hours of January 28th, 1547. King Henry VIII, the colossal figure who had dominated England and much of European politics for nearly 38 tumultuous years, is dead. The news is kept secret for a few days, a common practice to allow the new government to consolidate its position and prepare for a smooth announcement, preventing any potential unrest or opportunistic power grabs. You can imagine the frantic, hushed activity behind the closed doors of Greenwich Palace. Messengers scurrying, counselors conferring, the machinery of state shifting gears from one reign to the next, even as the old king's body still lies in his chamber. Archbishop Cranmer had been summoned, as Henry requested, but by the time he arrived, the king was speechless. Cranmer, as you heard, asked Henry to give a sign that he trusted in God through Jesus Christ for his salvation. Henry, a man whose life was filled with grand pronouncements and iron-willed declarations, could only manage to squeeze Cranmer's hand. A small, silent gesture at the very end of a life lived so loudly. Once Henry's death is publicly announced, the arrangements for his funeral and the preparations for the coronation of 9-year-old King Edward VI begin in earnest. Henry had, in his meticulously detailed will, specified his desire to be buried at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, alongside his third wife, Jane Seymour, the mother of his precious son and heir. This choice speaks volumes about who, among his 6 wives, he considered his one true queen, the one who had fulfilled her most crucial duty. Not Catherine of Aragon, his steadfast first wife of over 20 years, not Anne Boleyn, for whom he had fractured Christendom, not the politically expedient Anne of Cleves, not the tragic Catherine Howard, and not even his devoted final nurse and companion, Catherine Parr, only Jane, the mother of Edward. The journey of Henry's body from Westminster to Windsor for the burial is a grand and solemn procession, befitting a monarch of his stature. The coffin, enormous and heavily lead-lined to contain the decomposing immense corpse, is borne on a chariot draped in black velvet and cloth of gold, pulled by 8 horses. It is a spectacle of Tudor magnificence, even in death. But here, the narrative takes a rather bizarre and, shall we say, less than dignified turn. It is an authoritative historical fact, though one sometimes glossed over in more hagiographic accounts, that during an overnight stop at Sion Abbey, a former monastery that Henry himself had dissolved, an irony that probably wasn't lost on any lingering disgruntled monks, the king's coffin, which was already under considerable strain due to the weight and the, shall we say, active nature of decomposition within, actually burst open. Yes, you read that correctly. The immense pressure of the gases built up inside the lead coffin caused it to rupture. It's a rather gruesome image, isn't it? The most powerful king in English history, undone in death by the sheer bulk he had accumulated in life. One imagines the poor attendants detailed to clean up that particular royal mess. Probably not a job anyone volunteered for. Right, lads, who's on coffin leak duty tonight? No takers? Jenkins, you're up. If that wasn't unsettling enough, an odd and widely reported, though possibly apocryphal, story surrounds this incident. It was said that dogs were seen licking up the king's blood and bodily fluids that had seeped from the damaged coffin onto the floor. This tale gained particular traction because a friar named William Peto, or Peto, had, years earlier, preached a sermon before Henry, condemning his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and prophesying that dogs would lick his blood as they had licked the blood of the biblical king Ahab, a notorious sinner. This seeming fulfillment of the prophecy added a layer of Gothic horror and divine retribution to Henry's demise in the eyes of his Catholic detractors. It's the kind of grimly satisfying "I told you so" that must have given them a small, dark thrill. Whether it actually happened with the dogs or was simply too good a story not to tell, it certainly added to the bizarre legend of Henry's passing. The coffin was hastily repaired, presumably with extra lead and a lot of apologies to the lingering spirits of Sion Abbey, and the procession continued to Windsor. There, Henry was finally interred in a vault in St. George's Chapel, beneath a plain black marble slab beside Jane Seymour. He had planned a much grander, more magnificent tomb for himself, a colossal Renaissance masterpiece that was meant to rival the tombs of the French kings, but it was never completed. His son, Edward VI, was too young and his reign too short, and preoccupied with religious reform, and his daughters Mary I and Elizabeth I had other priorities, and perhaps less inclination to spend vast sums on a monument to their rather problematic father. So, the mighty Henry VIII lies in a surprisingly understated grave, though the sheer size of the vault itself speaks to his presence. Historians still debate the immediate impact of Henry's death on the religious and political stability of England. Did it usher in a period of hoped-for calm, or did it simply unleash the pent-up pressures and factionalisms that Henry's powerful personality had largely, though not always successfully, suppressed? The evidence suggests the latter. The Regency Council, despite Henry's intentions for a balanced collective, quickly saw Edward Seymour consolidate power as Lord Protector, Duke of Somerset, and push England further and faster down the path of Protestant reform than Henry himself might ever have countenanced. The strange, slightly macabre circumstances of his final journey and burial seemed almost a fittingly unsettling postscript to a reign that was anything but peaceful or predictable. The Colossus had fallen, and the reverberations, and perhaps a few rather unfortunate leakages, were only just beginning. The slightly unfortunate and certainly unregal image of Henry VIII's leaky coffin being licked by dogs, whether prophecy fulfilled or just a really good bit of Tudor-era gossip, eventually fades. The black marble slab in St. George's Chapel now lies quiet. What remains, however, are the deep, indelible marks Henry's reign left on England, and indeed on the wider world. You find yourself now not in a specific moment of his life, but in the echoing aftermath, considering the rather messy, complicated, and undeniably significant legacy he bequeathed. It's like standing in a room after a particularly raucous party. The main guests have gone, but the furniture is rearranged. There are some concerning stains on the carpet, and a lingering smell of, well, let's just say, significant historical impact. The most immediate and obvious legacy, of course, was the Church of England. By severing ties with Rome and declaring himself a supreme imamhead, Henry initiated a religious revolution whose consequences are still felt today. While he himself was doctrinally conservative in many ways, he wasn't trying to create a fully Protestant church in the Lutheran or Calvinist mold. He had opened the door. The subsequent reigns of his children saw England swing more dramatically. Edward VI pushed it towards more radical Protestantism, Mary I violently attempted to restore Catholicism, and Elizabeth I finally navigated a middle way with the Elizabethan settlement, creating a unique Anglican church. But it was Henry who took that first decisive, earth-shattering step. It's an authoritative historical fact that the dissolution of the monasteries, undertaken by Henry and masterminded by Cromwell between 1536 and 1541, dramatically redistributed wealth and land in England, fundamentally altering the social and economic landscape, and incidentally funding many of Henry's less successful wars. Vast monastic estates passed into the hands of the crown, and then, through sale or grant, to the nobility and gentry, creating a new class of landowners invested in maintaining the break with Rome. There was no going back easily after that. His personal life, with its 6 wives and the brutal dispatch of 2 of them, has, of course, become legendary, spawning countless books, films, and rather unflattering nursery rhymes. He turned the very personal quest for a male heir into a matter of state and international crisis, and in doing so, he made queenship in England an incredibly high-stakes, high-risk occupation. If you weren't providing sons, or if you displeased him, or if a rival faction simply wanted you gone, your position, and indeed your life, were perilously fragile. It's a bit like a very extreme version of a reality TV dating show, where being voted off doesn't just mean a taxi home, but a trip to the Tower. Then there's the Tudor dynasty itself. He succeeded in his primary aim. He left a male heir, Edward VI. Though Edward's reign was short, he was followed by his two half-sisters, Mary the Virfirst and Elizabeth I, both of whom Henry had at various times declared illegitimate, but later restored to the succession. The fact that two women could inherit and rule, despite all the earlier anxieties, is in itself a testament to the strength of the Tudor claim that Henry had, through whatever means, managed to solidify. Elizabeth I, in particular, would go on to become one of England's most iconic and successful monarchs, building on many of the foundations and dealing with many of the problems left by her father. An odd, or perhaps lesser-known aspect of Henry's legacy is his significant contribution to the development of the English Royal Navy. He invested heavily in shipbuilding, creating a fleet of powerful warships like the Mary Rose, which, as you might recall, famously and tragically sank. He established naval dockyards and a more permanent naval administration. This Navy Royal was crucial for England's defense and would later form the basis for its rise as a global maritime power. So, amidst all the marital drama and religious upheaval, he was also laying the groundwork for Britannia ruling the waves, albeit a few centuries down the line. Historians still debate the overall assessment of Henry VIII's reign. Was he a tyrannical monster, a self-indulgent egomaniac who reshaped a nation to suit his personal whims? Or was he a strong, decisive ruler who, for all his faults, laid the foundations for modern England, enhanced royal power, and navigated a complex European political landscape with a degree of ruthless skill? The truth, as is usually the case with such larger-than-life figures, is likely a messy combination of all these things. He was undoubtedly cruel, paranoid, and possessed of an almost limitless sense of his own entitlement. But he was also intelligent, charismatic, at least in his youth, and capable of inspiring loyalty as well as fear. He was a king of enormous appetites, for food, for women, for power, for theological debate, and he indulged them all on a grand scale. His bizarre death, the bursting coffin, the dogs, these almost comically macabre details seem, in a strange way, to encapsulate the more grotesque aspects of his later reign. The powerful, athletic prince had become a bloated, diseased parody of himself, and even in death, his physical excess couldn't quite be contained. But beyond the ghoulish anecdotes, the echoes of Henry's will, his words, and his actions resonate. He left England a nation fundamentally changed, its relationship with Europe redefined, its religious identity in flux, and its monarchy more absolute than ever before. He cast a very long, very wide, and often very dark shadow. From the studious boy you first glimpsed, frowning over his books, to the terrifying, ailing giant drawing his last breath, his journey was a truly extraordinary and transformative one. And now, as the echoes of his reign finally begin to soften, as the great tapestries of his life are slowly, carefully rolled up and stored away in the vast archives of history, you feel a sense of quiet settling over you. The intense drama of the Tudor court, with its whispered conspiracies and sudden executions, its glittering pageants and its profound personal tragedies begins to recede. The clatter of armor from the tilt-yard, the rustle of silks in the palace corridors, the sharp crack of a breaking lance, and the even sharper fall of the executioner's blade. All these sounds are fading now. The weight of crowns and the burden of dynastic expectation feel very far away. The flickering candlelight in those ancient stone rooms, illuminating faces fraught with ambition or fear, now seems to dim, giving way to a more restful, gentler darkness. The complexities of papal bulls and parliamentary acts, of annulments and accusations, no longer demand your attention. Even the most powerful and indomitable wills, like Henry's, must eventually yield to the great, slow tide of time, which smooths all rough edges and carries all stories towards a more distant, less urgent shore. Allow yourself to drift away from the stone walls of Greenwich and Windsor, away from the fervent prayers and the urgent political maneuverings. Let the rich, heavy scent of beeswax and old incense, mingled with the fainter, sharper tang of intrigue and perhaps a touch of French perfume, dissipate into the quiet air around you. The turbulent river of Henry's life, with all its passionate currents and dangerous whirlpools, has finally flowed into the vast, calm ocean of the past. There is nothing more to witness, nothing more to analyze. Just the slow, steady rhythm of your own breath, drawing you down into a peaceful, untroubled sleep. Rest now. The tutors can manage without you for a while.